Today's lesson is G7 leaders pledge action on global issues. Hi, everybody. I'm Roger.
And I'm Mike.
And today we've got a news story for you. We got some leaders of the world's major industrial nations. They're getting together, or at least they got together for a 3-day summit last June, and they want to get together and try to work out some of the world's problems.
Well, that would be very nice of them. And of course, this is the first sort of post-Trump summit, and I got the feeling that a lot of the world leaders were happy to welcome Joe Biden to their meeting to bring a little bit of calm, to not have all the sort of dramatic issues that they had over the last few years. And yes, there are some big issues for these leaders to discuss, and maybe one of the first meetings they've certainly had since COVID struck. I imagine they probably lost a few meetings over the last year and a half as, travel became an issue and a lot of these leaders didn't want to mix and potentially, spread disease amongst themselves. So yeah, this is one of their first times to kind of get together and plan a route for the world, plot a route for the world for a post-COVID world that we hope is coming sooner and sooner. So let's find out exactly what they discussed, what they got done, what they didn't get done possibly, and what the major issues were.
Okay, so let's get to it, everybody. Let's listen to the first part of our lesson, and then we'll be right back.
G7 leaders pledge action on global issues. Leaders of the world's major industrial nations ended their 3-day G7 summit in June with pledges on several issues. The group, from Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US, met at a seaside resort in Cornwall, England. On climate change, a key issue discussed, the leaders promised to step up action. They renewed a plan to raise $100 billion each year to help poorer countries cut emissions. They also agreed to help developing countries move away from coal. Still, some environmental groups expressed disappointment, saying the promises lacked detail.
大家好，第一部分我们看到单字 seaside， 这个字是形容词，指海滨的或是海边的。例如 Luna invited friends to her parents' seaside cabin. Luna 邀请朋友去她父母的海边小木屋。另外，这个字也可以当名词，指海边或是海滨。例如 Mary and her family spent their holiday at the seaside. Mary 和家人在海边度过假期。接着我们看到动词 renew， 指更新、重新开始或是重新建立关系。我们可以说 I renewed my book at the library because I am not done reading it yet. 我在图书馆续借了我的书，因为我还没读完。或是The television show renewed my interest in boats. 这个电视节目重启我对船的兴趣。另外，除了上面的意思，这个字还可以指再次发誓或是保证。例如 I called my mom and renewed my promise to visit her this Christmas. 我打电话给我妈妈，再次保证今年圣诞节会去看她。
Okay, so here in the title it says we've got G7 leaders and they pledge action on global issues. Now, all these people are our leaders, and we kind of expect something from them. We want them to promise us that they'll do something. So that's what the word pledge here means. It means they're promising to have some action on global issues, various things that we're all thinking about. And specifically, I think we're talking about climate change, and we're talking about, of course, the pandemic and also security issues, as certain countries seem to be causing some problems out there.
All right, so the article begins by basically just setting the scene, telling us what the main topic here is. Leaders of the world's major industrial nations ended their 3-day G7 summit in June with pledges on several issues. So that's right. It was a major meeting, a summit meeting. When we talk about a summit, we talk about a meeting of the top leaders, generally the presidents or prime ministers or leaders of countries get together. Now, of course, lower level government officials do often meet much more frequently, but the world leaders, since they're busy and since, of course, it's very complicated to organize all their schedules, they don't get together so often. So when it's a summit, it is the top leaders. And of course, whenever there's a meeting between like the US president and the leader of China or Russia or those kinds of countries, that can be a one-on-one summit, and that will be big news. In this case, it was the G7, the world's major industrial nations. The G just stands for group of 7 countries, and they met to try to come down with several pledges on different issues. A pledge is a promise, basically. So they come down, they say, this is what we plan to do, and we promise to work together to do it. In this case, of course, the G7. And who makes up the G7, Roger?
Well, here they're listed. The group from Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK and the US met at a seaside resort in Cornwall, England. Okay, so this is the group of 7 here. We've got the Canadians, the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese, and the British, along with the Americans. And they all got together in England. And of course, as you know, England is divided into shires. And the one that is the farthest to the south and west, I believe, is called Cornwall. And they've got this seaside resort there. So indeed, it's a resort. It's a place to have fun. It's got swimming pools there. You can probably try hang gliding and stuff like that. You can get a massage and things like that. Those are things that are available at resorts. And this one is right next to the sea. It's a seaside resort.
Sounds like a very picturesque and lovely part of England in which to have a big meeting, or for more commonly for people like you and I to take a nice holiday at a seaside resort. You could also call it a coastal resort. It's down by the sea. It's on the seaside. And actually, that's what British people say. They don't usually say we're going to the beach. They usually say we're going to the seaside. Something like that. A lovely day down by the sea.
Okay, well, the first issue that they discussed was climate change. So on climate change, or regarding climate change, a key issue discussed, that was climate change. The leaders promised to step up action. So here we've got the verb phrase to step up, which basically means to increase action. They all agreed that they should do more to fight climate change. And they renewed a plan to raise $100 billion each year to help poorer countries cut emissions. So again, they want to step up action. They had this plan before, but they renewed the plan. If you renew something, you just extend it, okay? The time has run out. For example, if you checked out books from the library, but you're not done with them, well, you can renew them. You can go back and get the time extended for another couple of weeks.
Exactly. Maybe it was a plan that sort of wasn't being focused on, or they weren't taking action on previously, but they've decided to try it again, to do it again, to begin it again. Raising a lot of money each year, $100 billion. This will be spread out among poorer countries to help them cut emissions. Of course, richer countries find it probably easier to switch from burning gas and coal to using solar power or something like that, but those switches in technology are expensive. And the dirtier technologies like burning wood, coal, oil are cheaper. So a lot of poorer countries are still relying on this older technology that does create a lot of pollution or a lot of harmful emissions. When we talk about emissions, we're talking about pollution generally, but an emission is basically anything that something gives off, probably through a process. Your body emits heat. That is an emission of your body, or sweat. When you're working really hard, you could say that, but generally when we think about it, we think of CO2, carbon monoxide, those types of chemicals and nasty things that come out in smoke and exhaust from machines burning fuel and whatnot. So helping these poor countries have cleaner energy, and this is types of energy that these poorer countries might not be able to achieve or afford on their own. So that's good. That would be a good thing. And it says they also, the G7 nations and the leaders, they also agreed to help developing countries move away away from coal. So this is a similar effort. Coal, I think, is probably one of the dirtiest things, but also one of the cheapest things that people burn to make energy. So yeah, if they're moving away from coal, they're trying to get them to use more solar, wind power, things like that, instead of using coal. But some environmental groups were not so happy even with that, it says.
Yes, it says still, even though they made these promises, still some environmental groups expressed disappointment, saying the promises lacked detail. And I can imagine what they're thinking here. Of course, when you get all these leaders together, there are a lot of speeches, a lot of talk, but sometimes there just isn't any substance. They're saying that, yes, we're going to help those developing countries stop using coal, but the environmental group said, well, what exactly are you going to do? You can't just say, you guys got to stop burning coal. That's not enough. You have to give them something else. They need to live. They need to heat their homes in the winter and cool them during the summer. So yeah, what can you actually give them? Give them some specifics here, and that's the environmental groups were having problems with. There just weren't any details in what these leaders said. Okay, that brings us to the end of the first part of our lesson for today. Let's move on now and talk about another issue that they discussed, the pandemic.
The pandemic was another major focus. In fighting the global emergency, the G7 leaders promised to donate at least 1 billion vaccine doses to poorer countries over the next year. They also called for the World Health Organization to begin an expert-led investigation into the origins of the coronavirus. The call came amid questions over whether the virus had leaked from a Chinese lab.
第二部分我们看到单字 vaccine， 这个字是名词，意思是疫苗。例如 Recently, more and more vaccines are being used to prevent cancer. 最近有越来越多疫苗用于癌症预防。另外补充这个字的动词 vaccinate, V-A-C-C-I-N-A-T-E, vaccinate, 指打疫苗或是预防接种。举例来说 The couple vaccinated their children before their trip. 那对夫妻在旅行之前帮他们的孩子打疫苗。接着我们看到介系词 amid， 指在点点点之间或是在点点点中。举例来说 I recognized no faces amid the crowd. 我在群众之中没看到手势的人。或是 Lucy finally found her cell phone amid the pile of clothing on her bed. Lucy 在床上一堆衣服当中找到她的手机。
Okay, so again, another major focus of this meeting of the nations of the G7. Another issue was the pandemic, of course. We've been hearing about that for a long time. I think most of us are sick and tired of hearing about the pandemic. It just doesn't seem to go away, but there you have it. We just have to live with it. And it was another major focus of this meeting. It's something that they discussed.
Exactly. In fighting the global emergency, the G7 leaders promised to donate at least 1 billion vaccine doses to poorer countries over the next year. So this is something else that they're going to do. Seems there are a few more details here with this type of plan. At least they have some numbers. They're going to donate, the G7 leaders and their countries, of course, will donate at least 1 billion vaccine doses to poorer countries over the next 12 months. So basically they're giving. When you donate something, you give it often to a good cause, right? If you're giving money to help out poor people or sick kids or animals that need help or something like that, you don't expect anything back in return. You're doing it out of kindness. You're doing it to help. You're doing it because you believe it's the right thing to do. So you're donating it. Generally, we would donate money, but if you give clothes to a homeless shelter or books to a small school or something like that, you're also donating those things. And we can even think of donating our time. If you volunteer your time and your energy, you're donating it in some way. You're giving something to a good cause. In this case, they will be donating vaccine, actual medicine, the vaccine, the AstraZeneca and Moderna and those ones that have been in the news, the medicines, the things that prevent you catching a disease. And that's basically what a vaccine is. It's a medicine you get before you catch the disease to avoid getting that disease, or if you get it, it won't be as deadly hopefully it won't be as dangerous to you. So this is sort of protective medicine that you take before you get sick so that hopefully you don't get sick. Most of these G7 countries have gotten a good job done of vaccinating their own populations. So now they're saying, well, we don't need so much of this medicine, these vaccines. We're going to give them away to other countries. And since people travel so much in the world, it really is the best way to get the world back to normal. You know, having one country be COVID-free doesn't really do them much good if they leave that country. And the more people get vaccinated, the safer it will be for us all.
Yep, even though lots of people are staying put and working at home, this is a global community we're living in now, the global village, and people are going to want to be moving around, traveling on business or for pleasure. So indeed, we got to have those vaccine doses distributed all over the world. And of course, every time you receive some medicine, if you get a shot or if you take some medicine by mouth, that will be a dose of medicine. So yes, they are donating at least 1 billion vaccine doses to poor countries over the next year. Now, they also called for the World Health Organization to begin an expert-led investigation into the origins of the coronavirus. So they want to get to the bottom of this disease. Where the heck did it come from? We need to understand how this thing got started and why it turned the world upside down. So if we have that information, then we can probably prevent something like that from happening in the future. Remember, there are still millions of viruses still out there somewhere, especially in bats. So we got to watch out for that. We don't want to let another virus start again.
That's right. If you call for something or some group to do something, that's basically sort of like a public appeal for something to happen, right? With a government or some group or even an individual can call for, I demand this, I want this to happen, and I'm serious about this. So if you call for justice or something like that, if you call for a certain authority to help a group of people who are in trouble, you're sort of making a public appeal, a public demand that this thing should happen. And the call to begin this investigation, the sort of demand to find out how did coronavirus start, where did it start, what happened with that whole story. Well, this call, this demand came amid questions over whether the virus had leaked from a Chinese lab. Yes, because of the Chinese authorities not really cooperating with the investigations into the origins or how COVID started, there are still many questions and many conspiracy theories, you could even say. Things that may or may not be true. We just don't know because we don't have information. A lot of other guesses start to come into the conversation. So this call comes amid questions, among. There are questions being asked, and at the same time the questions are being asked, and maybe because these questions are being asked, we have this call for more and better information about how COVID began way back in 2019. That seems like so long ago.
It does, but this problem is still with us as we speak. Okay, that brings us to the end of the second part of our lesson for today. Let's move on now to the third part and talk about the other thing that they discussed at this meeting.
Security issues were also on the table as the group discussed how to better deal with China and Russia. The meeting was held just days before U.S. President Joe Biden's planned summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
最后第三部分，我们看到片语 on the table， 表示计划、建议等被提交讨论中，像是 With the new proposal on the table, the two companies were close to an agreement. 由于该项新提案已提交讨论，双方公司已接近达成协议。或是 The couple has several offers on the table for their home. 那对夫妻已经收到许多人提议要购买他们的房子。另外补充一个相关片语 Lay one's cards on the table， 表示打开天窗说亮话或是摊牌。例如 Adam laid his cards on the table and told his father about his financial problems. Adam 向父亲摊牌，将自己的财务问题说给他听。
Okay, so far we're talking about the meeting of the G7. They talked about climate change. They talked about the pandemic. And finally, security issues were also on the table as the group discussed how to better deal with China and Russia. So, of course, this was the third thing that these countries discussed. These issues were on the table. If something's on the table, it's there for discussion.
Exactly. So yes, the issues with China and Russia are sort of ongoing and cover many different issues. The meeting, it says, this G7 meeting was held just days before U.S. President Joe Biden's planned summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin. So another summit on Joe Biden's schedule. This a two-leader summit just between him and the Russian president. But yes, the challenges of, China's growing power and Russia's sort of threats to its neighbors. In fact, Russia, I think, used to be called the G8 meeting because Russia was a member of this group for several years, but when they invaded Crimea 4 or 5 years ago, they were removed or they were kicked out. But still, Russia's relationships with the rest of the world and with the U.S. specifically are still important, Russia being a big country with nuclear weapons, among other things. So Joe Biden planned a second summit days later. I believe they met in Switzerland. He had that meeting with Vladimir Putin to talk about their own issues.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our discussion for today. It's time now to listen to our Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。课文第一部分有一个句子写到，气候变迁是 G7 峰会讨论的一大重要议题，那么各国领袖承诺会加快采取行动。文中它用到 step up action 来表达加快采取行动，那么 step up 的及物用法可以用来表达说像是增加、增强，可能是数量、速度等等，也可以指提高、增强，可能像是品质啊，或是程度等等。像我们可以说 step up production 就是表达增加产量，那么 step up performance 表示提升表现等等。好，那有一个相关片语叫做 step up one's game， 它是指说提升某人的能力和表现，提高本领的意思。那么其中的 game 它原本是指某个人他可能在比赛啊，或是游戏等等的技巧方法，那么在这边呢就是指技能的意思。另外 step up 它当不及物用法，那么字面的意思呢是说走上前去，也可以引申用来表达挺身而出去做某事，或者是呢在有需要啊或是有机会的时候采取行动。举例来说 They need to step up and take responsibility， 他们必须站出来承担责任。这边也再补充一个片语叫做 step up to the plate， 它本来啊是棒球用语，意思是说球员站上本垒板旁边准备打击，其中的 plate 就是指 home plate， 也就是棒球场上那个本垒板，而这个片语引申的意思就跟 take action 很相近，用来表达付诸行动，采取行动做某事。那通常呢它就带有这件事情可能不容易处理的那种语义。好，再来课文第二部分提到 G7 领袖们也呼吁世界卫生组织要开始针对新冠病毒的源头来进行一项由专家主导的调查。好，文中它用到片语动词 call for 来表达呼吁，我们来学习它的常见用法。第一种呢，我们可以用 call for 来表达要求、公开呼吁。那么常见的用法是 call for 加名词，或者是用 call for somebody to 加上原形动词来表达公开呼吁，要求某人做某事。例如Numerous celebrities have called for gun control， 许多名人公开呼吁枪支管制。好，那么第二个用法我们可以用 call for 来表达需要，这时候意思就跟 require 一样，它的受词可以是人或者是事物。举例来说 This job calls for computer skills， 这份工作需要电脑的相关技能。我们再造一个例句 You got the job?That calls for a celebration， 你得到那份工作啦，那就当然要庆祝一下咯。好，以上是今天重点整理，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Pledge The president pledged to make healthcare more affordable for citizens. Resort. Danny took his family to a ski resort during the winter vacation. Renew. Greg went to the transportation office to renew his driver's license. Emission. The factory was fined because its emissions were over the legal levels. Donate. Each month, Henry donates a portion of his paycheck to an animal shelter. Investigation. The police launched an investigation into the cause of the fire.
Discussion starter starts now!
Here's our discussion starter for today. In your opinion, what was the most important issue discussed by the G7 leaders and why?
Well, I would have to say that climate change was the most important issue discussed by the G7 leaders. It's crucial that the world starts to get a serious handle on this very serious problem. I mean, often with climate change, you listen to the talk of economies and pandemics and, all the other threats that we have around the world, and you often think, well, if they don't solve climate change, none of the other stuff is really important, right? If we can't live on a healthy earth, then the economy is going to be the second biggest problem or the third biggest problem. If we don't have fresh air to breathe, we won't be worried about face masks, we'll be worried about oxygen and things like that. So I often do think that even though it's complicated and I don't have any simple answers, climate change is certainly the most pressing and important issue for everyone on the planet.
Well, that's all fine and good, Mike, but in my opinion, the most important issue discussed by the G7 leaders was security. Because for the good people here in Taiwan, the threat of an invasion is very real, so we got to watch out for some of these countries. They might try to do something really naughty.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Mike.
I am Roger. See you next time.